It was supposed to be Alco's grand return, the moment they'd rise from the age of steam and take back their place atop America's railroads. The 244 diesel engine was meant to be the future, the answer to EMD's dominance, the machine that would bring Alco roaring into the modern age. But instead of glory, it delivered disaster. The story of the 244 is about how one desperate gamble, one flawed design, and one relentless rival could turn a proud name into a memory in the span of a decade. The 1940s were a time of transition, unlike anything the rail industry had ever seen. America had just emerged from World War II. Factories were booming, railroads were busier than ever, and the steam engines that once symbolized industrial might were showing their age. Smoke, soot, and long hours of maintenance no longer matched the new post-war vision of progress. The future was clean, efficient, and diesel-powered. At the center of this revolution stood EMD, the electromotive division of General Motors, a company that had mastered not just the engineering of diesel power, but the business of it. Their 567 engine was a marvel of reliability, the heart that beat inside locomotives like the FTs, F3s, and E units that were quickly conquering American main lines. These diesels needed hours of prep time, endless servicing, and a small army of maintenance crews. They just worked. And that consistency won over every railroad executive who once swore by steam. For Alco, aka the American Locomotive Company, this new age was a nightmare. For decades, they had ruled the rails. Their steam locomotives were legends, pulling heavy freight through mountains and hauling sleek passenger trains across the plains. But now, those heavy machines were being scrapped by the hundreds, replaced by EMD's efficient diesels. Alco's leadership could see what was coming. Their steam business was collapsing, and EMD was building a diesel empire that seemed unstoppable. They needed a rival, something powerful, modern, and ready yesterday. That's when engineers at Alco's Schenectady Works were told to build a new diesel engine, fast. What they came up with would become known as the 244. It was meant to be the lifeline that would keep Alco in the game. A brand new 4-stroke diesel that could match EMD's 567 in horsepower and surpass it in innovation. On paper, it had everything: turbocharging, flexibility in design, and configurations that could power freight units, passenger locomotives, and switchers alike. But behind those blueprints was a very different story. The deadlines were brutal, the testing incomplete, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Alco's engineers were trying to save a company that was slipping through their fingers. Every meeting carried a sense of urgency. Every prototype run was shadowed by executives demanding faster progress. There wasn't time for long-term testing, not when EMD was already selling thousands of diesels across the country. So, Alco did what desperate companies often do. They cut time wherever they could and pushed the 244 into production before it was ready. This was no minor project. The 244 was meant to beat the EMD's 567. It would power a new generation of Alco locomotives, the sleek PA passenger units that would rival EMD's E-Series, the muscular FA freight haulers built to take on the F units, and the versatile RS series switchers that could do it all. On paper, it looked like a masterpiece. A 12 or 16 cylinder 4-stroke diesel engine, turbocharged for maximum output, designed to deliver the kind of horsepower that could haul massive freight across mountain grades without breaking a sweat. Inside the engineering offices at Schenectady, there was cautious optimism. The 244 was ambitious, more advanced in theory than anything EMD had built. Alco's designers added a turbocharger to squeeze more power from each cylinder, while the modular layout was supposed to make maintenance and scaling easier. If it worked, Alco would leapfrog years ahead of its rival. But there was a catch. While EMD spent the year refining and perfecting its 567, proving it over millions of miles in freight service, Alco had been tied up with wartime contracts. When peace returned, EMD already had a bulletproof product on the market. Alco didn't have that luxury. They couldn't wait for perfection. They needed a finished engine now. So, in 1946, they rushed the 244 from design board to production line in record time. The first prototypes went into shiny new FA and PA units, proudly displayed to railroads hungry for diesel power. Orders came in, excitement grew, and for a brief moment, it seemed Alco was back. But that optimism didn't last long. Almost as soon as the locomotives hit the rails, the problems started showing up. Not small quirks, but fundamental design flaws that couldn't be ignored. Crankshafts began cracking under load, oil systems failed to deliver consistent lubrication, causing bearings to seize and engines to overheat. Turbochargers, one of the 244's main selling points, proved temperamental and fragile. Some railroads even reported engines failing within their first year of service. Shop crews began to dread the sound of a 244 rolling into the yard for repairs. Maintenance logs filled with reports of blown gaskets, misfiring injectors, and lubrication failures. The same mechanics who once praised Alco's rugged steam locomotives were now muttering under their breath about that cursed diesel. And meanwhile, EMD's 567 engines just kept running. Smooth, reliable, and almost boringly consistent. The irony was brutal. The 244 had been designed to prove Alco's technical superiority, and in some ways it really was ahead of its time, but the execution wasn't there. It had the brains of an engineer's dream and the bones of a rushed experiment, and as the breakdowns piled up, something worse began to fracture: Alco's reputation. Railroads had taken a gamble on the 244, hoping for a viable alternative to EMD's dominance. Instead, they found themselves with locomotives that demanded constant attention, frequent overhauls, and more downtime than anyone could afford. For Alco, the message was becoming painfully clear: they'd built a liability. Here is exactly what went wrong with the 244. By 1948, the optimism that had surrounded Alco's shiny new 244-powered locomotives was starting to evaporate fast. What began as a few isolated reports of trouble soon turned into a full-blown crisis that stretched across some of America's biggest railroads. The Santa Fe, the New York Central, the Delaware and Hudson. One by one, they began reporting the same pattern: engines overheating, crankcases leaking oil, bearings seizing mid-run, and gaskets failing under pressure. Crews were losing patience. Mechanics who had once trusted Alco's legendary steam locomotives, the same men who'd kept massive Hudsons and Niagaras alive through the war, were now spending their days fighting with diesel engines that seemed determined to break themselves. The 244 wasn't just unreliable, it was unpredictable. You never knew if it would make the next run or fail before leaving the yard. In an age when railroads were under pressure to modernize, downtime was deadly. EMD locomotives powered by the 567 were racking up millions of miles with near flawless reliability, while Alco units were stacking up repair tickets. The gap wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. Crews started to dread being assigned to Alco power. It wasn't a question of if something would go wrong, but when. The root cause of the 244's failures came down to one unforgiving truth: the engine had been pushed into production before it was ready. Alco's engineers had tried to fix the issues as they surfaced: revised bearings, redesigned gaskets, improved oil circulation. But those fixes often came after locomotives had already failed in service. Every time a 244 broke down in front of a customer, it wasn't just a repair job. It was another hit to Alco's credibility. And once confidence started to crack, it spread like wildfire. At first, the railroads gave Alco the benefit of the doubt. After all, this was the company that had built some of the greatest steam locomotives in American history. But after the third or fourth engine failure, after another freight stalled halfway up a mountain, or a passenger train missed its schedule, patience turned into resentment. Maintenance shops began using darker nicknames for the engine: the cursed diesel, the mechanic's nightmare, or simply the 244 problem. Word spread quickly through the industry. In railroad depots and engineering offices across the country, the same line kept coming up: if it's got a 244 in it, we don't want it. That sentence marked the turning point. It wasn't just the failures themselves, it was the frequency and the visibility. Locomotives stranded on main lines, smoke pouring from the engine room, oil dripping onto the ballast. These were public embarrassments for railroads that prided themselves on efficiency. And every public failure reflected back on Alco. Inside Alco's own facilities, engineers worked tirelessly to save the 244's image. Field service teams were dispatched to assist struggling railroads. New technical bulletins were released almost weekly, and test stands ran around the clock in Schenectady trying to isolate the next weak point before customers found it for them. But it was like patching a sinking ship with duct tape. The reality was harsh. By the time the fixes arrived, the reputation was gone. Railroads no longer cared about incremental improvements. They wanted reliability, and Alco couldn't guarantee it. EMD, on the other hand, didn't just sell locomotives, it sold peace of mind. For Alco, the 244 debacle was more than an engineering problem. It was a betrayal of trust. The same engineers and railroad executives who had once believed in Alco's craftsmanship were now turning their backs. And in the locomotive business, once a railroad loses faith in your engines, it's almost impossible to win it back. By the early 1950s, the fallout from the 244's failures had reached a breaking point. Railroads across the country, the same ones that had once proudly showcased Alco locomotives on their main lines, started walking away. One after another, they canceled orders, deferred deliveries, or quietly switched to the competition. And that competition? It was EMD, the unstoppable force that had been waiting for exactly this moment. While Alco was busy patching leaks, EMD was rolling out the GP7, the GP9, and an ever-growing family of F units. These weren't glamorous machines, but they didn't have to be. They were dependable, efficient, and almost boringly reliable. And in railroading, boring is beautiful. Crews trusted them, mechanics praised them, railroads loved them. Alco, on the other hand, found itself trapped by its own reputation. Even after redesigning the 244's components and issuing countless service bulletins, the stigma refused to die. The industry had a long memory, and the phrase "powered by a 244" had become shorthand for "expect trouble." Inside Alco's sales offices, frustration ran deep. They could improve the engines all they wanted, but no amount of engineering could undo what the 244 had already done to their name. Purchasing departments across the country began to quietly blacklist Alco, not through any official memo or boycott, but through silence. When bids went out for new locomotives, Alco's proposals were ignored. Decisions were already made before the paperwork even hit the table. Alco's market share plummeted almost overnight. Where they had once competed head-to-head with EMD for every major diesel order, they were now scraping for scraps, switching locomotives, branch line orders, or second-tier contracts. Financially, the company was bleeding. The 244's warranty claims drained resources, parts replacements cut into profit margins, and rebuilding the engines under goodwill programs only deepened the losses. But the real damage was long-term, the loss of trust. Once a railroad switched to EMD, it almost never came back. By 1956, Alco was desperate for redemption. The scars left by the 244 were still raw, but the company refused to go down quietly. In a final bid to reclaim its reputation, Alco unveiled the 251 engine, a completely reimagined power plant designed to prove that they could still compete with EMD's engineering juggernaut. This wasn't a patch job or a quick fix. The 251 was built from the ground up. It had a stronger block, far more reliable lubrication system, and a turbocharger that could finally handle the stress of long-haul service. Every flaw that had haunted the 244 was meticulously addressed. Alco engineers poured years of research, testing, and pride into making sure the 251 wouldn't just run, it would endure. And it did. The 251 powered Alco's C-Series, and later the sleek Century locomotives, machines that could finally stand shoulder to shoulder with anything EMD was offering. On paper, it was everything railroads had once wanted from Alco: raw power, smooth operation, and modern efficiency. In the field, it proved capable and tough. Maintenance crews who actually worked on the 251 admired its design, and some even called it one of the best diesel engines Alco ever built. But the problem wasn't the engine anymore, it was the memory. A decade of bad press and broken promises had poisoned Alco's image. The railroads that once relied on them had long since switched to EMD, and they weren't coming back. Even as the 251 racked up solid performance records, decision makers across the industry had already written off the company. To them, Alco still meant one thing: unreliability. It was the classic case of being right too late. The 251 could have saved Alco if it had come 5 years earlier, before the 244 debacle turned faith into skepticism. But by 1956, EMD's dominance was absolute. The GP9 was rewriting the rules of diesel traction, and railroads were doubling down on standardization, meaning they wanted one supplier, one engine type, and one maintenance system. And that supplier was EMD. For Alco, it must have been heartbreaking. They had finally built the engine they always promised, and no one cared. It ran beautifully, pulled freight and passengers reliably, and in another timeline, it might have secured Alco's future. But history doesn't reward those who get it right after the world stops watching. In the end, the 251 stood as both a triumph and a tragedy, proof that Alco could still engineer greatness. But also a reminder that in the railroad industry, trust once lost is never fully regained. That's how the Alco 244 became a legend for all the wrong reasons. Yet decades later, there's a strange irony. Rail fans still admire the FA and PA units, not for how they ran, but for how they looked and sounded. Their streamlined bodies and that unforgettable turbocharged roar earned them a kind of tragic respect. But beneath the beauty lay an engine that nearly destroyed its maker. The shocking truth? The 244 was never banned by law. It was banned by reputation, by the men who ran the rails and refused to be burned twice. It's easy to forget how close Alco came to beating EMD, but one rushed decision in 1946 turned a proud company into a mess. That brings us to the end of the video. Did you ever hear a 244 run or see one fail in service? Tell us in the comments and subscribe for more stories of the machines that changed railroading, for better or worse.